This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal, tax, investment, financial, or other advice. It is not intended to cause or induce breach of an existing agency agreement.
Okay, so we're here with Andrew List. He is the Director of Economics and Data Analytics at REBGV, or the Real Estate Board of Greater Vancouver. How you doing, Andrew?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks for taking the time. And I got to say, you are one of the most recommended people we've had from other guests on our show. They've all said, you got to get Andrew on the program. So we're super excited to have you in the studio.
Yeah, that's hugely flattering. So
thanks for taking the time, for sure.
Can you maybe start by, we know you from the context of the Real Estate Board of Greater Vancouver, but can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So my current role is building out the analytics capacity of the Real Estate Board of Greater Vancouver. So that's, it's a pretty multifaceted role, actually. There's a lot going on. So I'll be in the sort of front person in the media talking about the market and where it's going, but I'm also doing a lot of back end work there that most people wouldn't see in terms of building out our data, like pipelines, and how we're going to turn that into useful products and tools that members and the public and media can use. So that's kind of the current incarnation of what I'm doing. Prior to that, I was with the BC government, actually in the housing policy branch of government. So I was the only economist working there, which might surprise some people. It certainly surprised me when I showed up. That was an interesting role. I was there for about 4 or 5 years. And prior to that, I worked with CMHC in a similar kind of capacity, working as an economist there, doing market analysis and so on. And then I've had some totally unrelated careers prior to that. Is worked as like a draftsman and designer for many years, and
oh wow,
yeah, even as a semi-pro musician that wasn't particularly good. But
this is exciting for the 5-wire when we get to our favorite music question. But wow,
yeah, it's a kind of a diverse background, I guess, in a lot of ways.
And was that not to get too sidetracked, but were you in a band or many bands, or
no, more of a studio person?
Oh,
so I did
Muscle Shoals type,
sort of. Yeah, so I did like studio work.
A studio.
I used to produce what I used to call kind of musical selections. This was back in the day when, there's MySpace and those kinds of things.
Right.
And so, at the time, hip hop was a pretty popular genre of music. And one of the issues that a lot of hip hop artists had was that they had to, if you wanted to get a track for your raps or whatever, you're going to need to probably clear some royalties or something if you want to use samples. So I play like a bunch of different instruments, and I would create music that sounds like something they might have sampled, but it wasn't sampled. It was fully original. So you didn't have to clear royalties or anything. And then I sold those as, prepackaged beats.
Wow.
But I didn't make very much money. So
yeah. Wow.
That's cool.
So you were like recreating samples.
Yeah. Like it was, I would create these kinds of compositions, if you will, of various kinds. Like, people would come to me with a idea in their head about what they wanted something to sound like, or they would just go through my library of things that I, created on my own. And I did that for a couple of years. I didn't really make any money, to be honest. It was like, it's a really, music business in general is just a really challenging career. And also like that niche area of it was pretty hyper specific and extra niche. So it's like making just compounding the difficulty level of making a buck in there. It was a fun time, but on to other things now.
Fair enough. Why real estate, Andrew?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think on the analytical side of it, for me, it's just like, I like really hard puzzles, so I like problems that don't have really obvious solutions to them, or analytical projects that could kind of take you weeks or months or years. Like, I mean, honestly, probably in the conversation we have today, there's things that I've been thinking about in this space for 10 plus years that I still have like an evolution of thought on. So, real estate's just like a fascinating intersection of so many different facets of life and the economy and all kinds of things. And the reasons that people choose to live where they live and so on, or how they live and what kind of space and, whatever, these are really interesting dynamic. I think they're really interesting from like a data perspective and so on, and from a storytelling perspective. In a more like practical sense of it, my family and myself was always kind of a family of moving, houses and renovating them. Not the flipping sort of thing, but just we just bought a property and we always had this renovation going on. Like there was always one. I grew up around like hammers and nails my whole life.
Right.
And so always really interested in like ways that you can add value to a property or change a property to like a different use and make it, fit what it is that you want out of it. And I kind of continued that tradition myself. I bought a home and I gutted it myself and I'm like doing everything myself.
Sounds like you like puzzles.
Yeah,
like really
yeah.
complicated puzzles.
I like biting off way more than I can chew.
Expensive puzzles.
Yeah. It's definitely not cheap. It's harder than a lot of people think. But like I really enjoy the puzzles and having a bit of a background in design and whatnot in terms of how things work. Like I'm not an engineer, by the way. I just did drafting and design work. So that was more specialized in the mechanical and electrical sides of it. So I would design restaurant kitchens and so on, like the exhaust systems for them and all of these other things. Anyways, that's a whole other story. But so knowing a lot about those things helps to think through how buildings are structured, how like the mechanical systems and everything integrate into buildings and what you need to do to make sure that everything works and whatever. So it's kind of just an interest of mine, and I like fixing things, and so marry those things together, and that's part of the real estate bit for me as well.
Well, there's a lot of fixing required in this market, I guess.
So along those lines, I'm just curious, and I'm not even sure how to frame this question, but you've worked now for the Real Estate Board of Greater Vancouver, you've worked for the provincial government, you've worked for CMHC or a Crown Corporation.
Yeah.
What's your take on how different stakeholders in the Canadian housing space are communicating with each other? Are they communicating effectively? Are they asking similar questions? Do they have similar solutions? Or is it totally at odds? Like the thing that you said about being the only economist at the province kind of struck me there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty surprising kind of fact in some ways. I mean, when I started there, well, let me kind of answer your question first. I think so. Each stakeholder, if you will, has a pretty different. Some of them have very different mandates. Like the Bank of Canada has a mandate. CMHC has kind of a mandate given by government of what it is they're trying to achieve. The provincial government, the housing minister has a mandate letter, and there's outcomes that are expected. Working at the board, it doesn't have a mandate per se, but has a reason to exist and a function that it plays in the space of real estate. All of these stakeholders have kind of similarities and some pretty big dissimilarities in some ways. I think where a lot of things get off, where there's a lot more like disagreement, I guess, on things is in the perspectives about what are the causes or reasons for the situations that we find in front of us. It's often the housing issue is often referred to as a housing crisis. Just the language of that itself is a construction of who you are speaking to. The choice of calling it a crisis is something that, I'm not trying to suggest that it isn't a crisis, because for many people it very much is. It just depends on who you're speaking with and what what their context is. And so where I think things get really dysfunctional is not understanding what it means when you call it a crisis. Because if you can't quite define that or pin it down very well as what it is that you're saying specifically is the problem, it's hard to design solutions for it that are effective and target the specific segment that you think is the issue. And there's a lot of disagreement about what the issues are. And there's a lot of speculation about certain issues that may or may not be issues. And this is just kind of the way that things work. And like I did a presentation on this actually back in January, which is actually on the REBGV website. You can go there. We got, thanks to my REBGV team, I've now got an economics page on the website. So you can find anything that I've done there. And did like an hour-long show, I kind of call it, where it was called Dysfunction by Design. And it's a presentation that discusses kind of the state of the market, what I see as some of the big drivers and some of the big points of disagreement in terms of the context of the discussion of the housing crisis and so on. And it's my take on why things are so dysfunctional, why organizations approach the question of the housing crisis from such different angles. And it kind of gets into a lot of those bits in a I think a fun and engaging way that, we've got a lot of data, a lot of charts, and kind of bring the audience along with me in discovering what it is and how I think through those kinds of things. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a long-winded answer, sorry, to your question, but it's there's a lot to it. It's a hard question to unpack.
Right. But and just to, if you were to give like a 3-minute, and we got all after. No, and I don't mean that that was a long answer. I mean it more like, it was an hour presentation, Dysfunction by Design, the synopsis. Can you give us the kind of Cole's notes?
Sure. So kind of at like the highest level, I go through, I think, 4 or 5 kind of major issues, if you will. Like it kind of starts with speaking about the ideas behind supply and demand and how the kind of, I don't even know how to describe this, but it's like the way that economists tend to think about, all kinds of markets, that often gets reduced to a very simplistic form of something like, supply and demand. And then everybody uses that as the jump off point for a lot of discussions. But I think there's a big missing piece in all of that, in that discussion is not rich enough to answer the questions that need to be answered. So that kind of sets up the future pieces of the show, where I start getting into like population growth and like demographic issues and policy issues and the issues around the central bank and how they operate and how what they're doing has impacts in the housing market and all that stuff. So it's like this big. It's kind of hard to give like a 2 to 3 minute thing, because everything's so intertwined, and that's kind of the point of the show, is that like at the end of it you really see how intertwined all these issues are. And you start, hopefully, I mean, my goal with a show like that is that like the viewer comes away thinking like, that's a lot more complicated than I thought it was. And maybe my simple solution that I have for something isn't really as easy to implement as I thought. And like, I'm not trying to discourage people from coming up with ideas of how to fix things. I'm just trying to encourage people to think about them in a richer way, with like a lot more information around it about understanding the context of what it is you're talking about. If you say you've got a solution to something, well, do you really understand the problem? Do you know exactly the nuts and bolts of it? Do you know how that thing operates really well, so that your solution, whatever it is you're proposing, actually targets the things that you're trying to hit and doesn't hit a bunch of other things unnecessarily? And so it's kind of, that's what the discussion that I'm trying to get out there with that particular piece. And it was also to set up the forecast that we did in January, to give like a bit of a high level overview of my thinking about it and why the forecast was put together the way it was. And so, yeah, that's kind of that piece. Again, sorry, not a 3-minute thing.
No, that's fascinating. And the 2 things that kind of strike me, one from your earlier answer of talking about how you've been trying to understand the market or certain questions in the market for over a decade, and how it's been an evolutionary process. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because we talk about that on the show. Like how I felt I understood the market in 2015 is dramatically different than how I feel now. Can you talk a little bit about that evolution and maybe is it that that before it has it gotten more complicated, your understanding of real estate, or has it got more simplistic? Or
yeah, that's such a good question, and I can definitely talk about that. It's so if you'd asked me, back in 2015, 2016, what the driver of our market was, because that was a period of like heightened, activity.
That question was being asked a lot.
It was like, what is going on? And honestly, actually yesterday I was looking at some of the data and looking back at it, and I was like, 2014, 2015, 2016 still looks weird from a data perspective. When I look at a chart like that, I see a chart that has some regularity in it, and then boom, something hits in 2014, and you're like, what is that? There's something off about that data. It doesn't look right. Something happened that I don't have a full explanation for. And so everybody at the time was searching for explanations everywhere. And so this is where you get the stories of foreign investors and all that kind of thing, because it's not that there's like, look, I look at the population data, you look at some other stuff around that period of time, and everything looks pretty normal. There's like nothing really totally way off about that period of time, except for the real estate data.
Right.
Like all of a sudden the inventory of apartments just like tanks. Why? Why did it just get so like dragged down so in such a sustained form for such a long period of time? And that had big knock-on effects on everything in the market. That drove prices higher really rapidly. Even the detached market was ripping higher in pricing, even though inventory for it was rising. It was going in a different direction than the inventory for apartment. And it's like, what the heck was going? Like a lot of the things that are supposed to add up weren't adding up. And so I think quite rightfully, a lot of people came to, all kinds of different conclusions about what might be driving it. Now, whether they were correct in what those things actually were, that, it's proven that the foreign buyer issue probably wasn't as big of an issue as people thought. However, the data, we don't have the data going back pre-2016. And at the very first chunk of that, when, there was, when the foreign buyers tax and stuff came in, those first bits of data showed a much higher level of foreign investment activity in the market than it did a few months after, which was obvious because that's the point of the of the legislation,
tax,
right?
yeah.
Like that's the point. Like the outcome that was observed was exactly what you'd hoped. But what we don't have is all the initial data. And I'm not trying to insinuate that it was for sure foreign buyers. I'm just trying to say that there are data points that kind of exist that when you look at the totality of it and you're trying to explain this particular phenomenon, there just isn't really like a lot of great data points that all add up to some neat little tidy story about what exactly happened and what drove it. And that's definitely where you get the kind of leeway that a lot of people take in making those declarations about what the cause was, and it's sort of like, well, I'm always a bit more skeptical about just about everything. Like as somebody who's in the data space, like I probably surprise a lot of people to hear this, but like I don't trust data at all. Like I look at data, and I'm like, that's BS, that stuff. It's kind of like I have to know exactly how that data was generated for me to have faith in it. And when you start spending the time to like learn the data generating processes of stuff, like even if we talk about real estate market data, like every month stuff comes in, right? So you guys go out, do a bunch of deals, that shows up in the market data, but when the closing times and stuff, like those matter for when you count a sale in some particular month or whatever, or like, and there's reasons why something might lapse over the end of the month or something that it probably should have been a sale counted in 1 month, but it isn't counted. And like, it might seem like a minor detail, but you start adding this up across the whole spectrum of things and the data starts getting kind of washy under the surface. It's not as concrete as people believe it to be. And like, a lot of data is like that, whether it's StatsCan data or whatever, there's a ton of data that under the surface of it all really isn't, as true, if you will, as people think it is. Now, they are facts, but they have to be interpreted correctly. You have to have the kind of understanding about what is happening underneath it to really get that message across, whatever it is you're trying to say, So, it's the whole thing with like real estate and all of these data points is like there is while there is a lot to look at now, there wasn't 10 something years ago, or not as much anyways, and the focus on things certainly wasn't as heightened as it used to be. So now, everybody's really trying to grapple with questions of like affordability, why are prices what they are, and all these things. And yeah, it's challenging to answer from just like one or two data points. You really got to look at things in this really more holistic perspective, which again, that's kind of part of what I was trying to do in that presentation I did back in January, is like kind of try to bring a lot more of the pieces together, but I only had an hour and I could talk for 10 hours about that,
all the pieces. Yeah.
Yeah. So
are you, I'm just thinking from what you said, are you confident that does the picture get clearer with more data? Because and I remember that critique. We don't know who's buying the real estate. We don't know their nationality or where they're from or whatever back in 2015 or 2014 or whenever it was. Like with the increased collection of data, do you think this becomes muddier or is there a a clarity that's emerging?
Yeah, I would say generally more data is good. It's welcome. It's certainly welcome to the discussion, especially if it helps to elucidate more better answers about certain phenomenon that, like, particularly, say, like, just use the foreign buyers as an example, right? Like, we have decent data on that now that suggests it's not really as much of a driver or a market as it was perceived to be back then. Like I said, we don't have the data pre-2016 really, so it's kind of hard to say what exactly was going on there without that. And that's kind of the benefit and curse of more data. It's like, well, the benefit is you could say something concretely about it, but then the curse is that, like, you always kind of start wanting more because like, if you don't just settle your explanation at some point and cut it off and say, okay, well, that's enough. I think I know roughly what was happening there. Then you kind of always start wanting more. And the more you pick away at something, the more like each like data point starts raising questions about other data points. Like, that happens to me all the time. I'll look at something and I'll be like, oh, that's interesting. And then, I'll start digging into it. I'm like, oh, well, why is this happening? I start digging down another hole. And then, like, 10 days later, I come out of it with like 10 different stories about things. They're all interesting, and they're things that I'll probably do at some point in some kind of piece somewhere. But, you ultimately don't even arrive at the conclusion that you were seeking. You just end up kind of spinning your wheels even more. But again, that's kind of why I like this business of real estate and so on. It's a fascinating space with so many intersections. And, like, if you're a data person and you like hard puzzles, I highly recommend working in this space and trying to, like, figure things out, because we're definitely short on people with great ideas of how to do better data work in this side of things. Economics historically hasn't done a great job looking at housing issues. It was kind of a tertiary subject in economics. It was never really the focus for a lot of economists, and so there's a dearth of good research and analysis in there to guide discussions that we have today. So yeah, it's anyway, sorry, rambling again, but it's a fascinating space.
I just wanted to also kind of go back. The second thing that you said that's really interesting is kind of getting clarity when we talk about real estate, about what we mean, and really identifying the pain points and going deep to really understand that. We've had a number of people on the show that are in a variety of different sectors of the industry that have talked about David Eby, for example, not to get political, but being a bull in a china shop right now with the housing plan, making a lot of changes that maybe we don't know what the repercussions are. And you've talked about this, like, if you're not clear, there's going to be spin-off effects.
Yeah.
How do you think we get clearer on our collective understanding about the market, so we can actually are there steps that we can take to actually get better policy as a result that's maybe that maybe doesn't have the repercussions, like, say,
we didn't understand that problem, so the solution is
that's it,
and the wrong one. Yeah,
and you think about these, it's always been kind of more the not so much supply, but focused on demand side measures, right? Mm-hmm. Where they've had a lot of spin-off effects.
Yeah. So as somebody who kind of has worked, like I worked in the sausage factory, if you will, and I've seen how that's made, and the way that I got to be kind of careful the way I phrase it. I don't want to, like, throw my former employers or something under the bus, sure, but, like, I'm just trying to be honest with your listeners and you as well. Like, the way that here's my sort of cynical take on it, I guess, if you will. Policy is meant to be evidence-based. Like, it's something that, as the voting public, when you vote someone in, you hope that those elected officials bring with them the kind of work ethic that would be like, hey, if we're going to implement some big change to something, then we should be able to back up the research with that and justify it. And the reality, the way that I see it, and this may not be the case, I got to be careful, because this probably is not the case across all sectors of policy and something, but when it comes to, like, the real estate side of it, my view, and this is, again, my personal view on this, is that instead of it being, like, evidence-based policy making, it's kind of like policy-based evidence making. Like, sometimes there's ideas that get the attention of the political sphere that are very popular with voters. And those ideas may not actually be the ones that will move the needle the most in the direction that the population wants. But they're great pieces for politicians to go out and, slam the hammer down on or whatever. And they're really probably not going to have a big meaningful impact in the market. But they're great sound bites, and they're, and sometimes the research, if you will, there isn't any. Like there's just somebody, somebody will see something on Twitter and they'll think, oh, hey, I want to know about that. And like, it sounds like it's an issue for housing. We should be doing something about that. And it's like, yeah, then you go look into it and you say it's not really an issue, but they're like, well, yeah, but people are talking about it on Twitter, so we should probably do something about that. Sure. And I think like realistically, if you look at some of the platforms put forth by political parties and stuff, and then you compare that to what you might see on Twitter and things like that, there's a high correlation between what people are talking about on Twitter and what's there. And my point is not that what people are talking about on Twitter isn't real. It is in some ways. For a lot of people, it's real. Are they the issues that have the biggest potential to move the market or whatever, move the housing discussion in the correct direction? Probably not. I mean, Twitter's not really a great bellwether for almost anything in terms of discussions. Right, and right. I think that's kind of the problem, is that we live in a world where, media and all of this is attention hungry, and it requires pieces that really grab people. And oftentimes those pieces are not the real story. And like the real story with housing, and it's been the story for a long time, is the supply issue. And I have thoughts about that as well, but it's a boring story, right? Like it's not sexy to go out on the radio and talk about, well, we need to add 10,000 more units. It's like, so, it's like, it's what about those speculators, right? It's like, what about those?
And it's going to take years to actually produce the housing that we need.
And we don't know how to do it.
Exactly. Yeah. So,
it's actually a boring and complicated story, I guess, in a lot of ways. Maybe shifting gears a little bit because, and I think this will get into, supply and everything else, but how's the market? And we should timestamp. We're talking
to we should timestamp
April 19th, 2023. So I feel like a lot of people are kind of surprised in the spring market. You may or may not be as surprised as a lot, but how is the market and what's your take?
Yeah, it's these are difficult. Like timestamping anything is always the worst because you're going to go back.
The umbrella already timestamped.
Yeah. So it's okay. So the market right now actually is surprisingly doing better than I thought it would in a lot of ways, especially on the pricing side. So we did a forecast in January, and when I did that forecast, it called for price growth. And I think at the time, there was still some uncertainty whether we were going to have more rate hikes and whatnot, and where the economy's at. That still is a kind of a big question mark because it's a bit odd, right? We have unemployment at very low levels. I think like under the surface, everything on the data side of it, everything looks kind of okay from the economy sort of perspective of it. But there's all these other like little weird data points here and that flash kind of danger signs on occasion, like yield curves and whatever. Those sometimes indicate an imminent recession. But like the market, based on all that, it's surprising. You got a huge increase in the policy rate from the Bank of Canada. It's just over a really short period of time. And that's obviously translated into higher mortgage costs and, has the exact effect that you would expect on the market. Huge decrease in sales. And like also, 2021 and 22 were pretty crazy years in some ways. They're like outliers in the data and in some senses, right? You look at the sales figures for them, like they were pretty strong years in some sections of it. So comparing, today to those periods of time is always rough because it's like, oh, sales are down 50-something%. It's a big number and it sounds really scary. But looking at it, it's like, given what's happened with interest rates and so on and where we are, that's a surprisingly resilient number that I like for someone like me who looks at the data a lot. I'm like, well, that's actually kind of surprising that it's doing as well as it's doing. Then on the pricing element of it, so I got to the board and started working with their data and built these forecasting models for it. And I'm not a huge fan of forecasting, to be honest. It's just sort of like something you do because it's part of the organization. And we want to get that out to the public. And I think it's meaningful in some ways, but it's hard to get it right. And so I built all these models that try to help figure this out. But one of the interesting things about all these models I built, the one thing they kept picking up on was the severely low level of inventory. And because of that, every single one of the models I was running wanted to drive prices higher. It was saying, in the future, because your inventory level is so low, you have like this really high probability that prices will rise. And I was like, well, yeah, but the thing is, you got the interest rate scenario butting up against that, right? So you have to kind of weigh these things. And so what I ended up doing in the forecast is I kind of, by hand brought the price forecast down, saying, I don't know if it's going to go as high as what my model was saying. And so far, we're actually beating where the model was, or we're like heading to where the model was supposed to be. And we're above the forecast already in terms of price, which was modest. I was saying like 1% to 2% growth, but a lot of people were like, no, the bottom's not in, this is Armageddon and whatever. It's like, well, nah, not really. Like I think the bottom was in somewhere around the middle of winter or something like
November.
that. Yeah, it seemed like things were starting to turn at that point, like in a positive direction. And yeah, so the pricing things really kind of surprised me a bit because I was hesitant to put out a forecast that was calling for significant price growth, even though, like the underlying issue, which all the models were picking up on, is the inventory story. Like we're really low. Like the Greater Vancouver region has a lot of people. It grows every year. We have more and more people here. But somehow the inventory levels keep kind of dropping, right? Like you would think with new housing construction coming online and all these new people moving here, that more people might move and you might get more listings and things on the market here. You'd think there would be some kind of correlation with growth, but there is, but it's in the opposite direction. You have growth and then you have a decline. In the listing counts and so on. And like that makes sense from the perspective of, well, you're kind of running out of supply is what it's saying in a way, right? Like if you keep growing the population but you don't grow the housing stock, eventually like listings and everything's just going to kind of lock up because nobody's going to want to move anywhere. There's nowhere to go,
right.
So it's that's the part that's been driving the pricing higher, and like on the on the ratios like sales to active listings and all that, or you can flip it and do months of inventory or whatever. Those are definitely suggesting continued price growth because they're kind of verging into that seller's market territory, right? And like those, I got to be careful with those because we're going to be doing a project on that this year that I'm hoping to do at the board where like all of those should really be like sales to active listing ratios, and those buyers and sellers markets, they should be calibrated on a per market basis. Like it's not the best to use one ratio for everywhere because it actually tends to vary. Like when you dig into the numbers and you say like, well, at what ratio do prices actually start rising? It can vary a little bit by area or product type and so on. So what I want to do as a project is kind of unpack that and create like a set of data for people to use where it's like, oh, well, here's the correct ratio for your market, and it'll adjust over time. It evolves over time as new data comes in and so on. So but yeah, it's been interesting just to see how the market shifted towards that seller side of it, almost everywhere. And yeah, I guess it still continues to surprise me a bit that pricing is moving up with rates being where they're at. It's expensive to borrow right now.
It's so interesting because I feel like if somebody was to say, what's the story in the real estate market? It's interest rates, right? It's been that way for a year and potentially, since 2010 or whatever, with the low interest rates, like that's been a huge driving factor that a lot of people talk about. But if you were to write a headline for 2023, is it an interest rate story or so far, I guess, or is it an inventory story?
Yeah. So definitely an inventory story, I would say. I mean, the rate story is super important, but right now you have this lack of new listings, which is another thing I want to kind of dig into. I don't have a great answer for this, honestly, right now. Why are new listings so low? Well, the anecdotal take is that, people don't have a place to go. Like if you're a seller, you're like, well, I don't have a spot picked out. I'm not going to list. And with borrowing costs being what they are, I'm just going to sit on the sidelines and whatever until market conditions improve, which I think is a perfectly plausible story or whatever. But I'm always skeptical of data and stories. I'm always like, well, is there something more to it? Is there something else that I can point to as a point of interest or something? And I haven't found that yet, but it is an interesting dynamic, and I think it's one that's going to continue to play out into the end part of the year. And I think actually on the topic of that forecast, I think that's going to be one of the features that causes the sales forecast we have to maybe be a bit lower than we were calling for, because right now where the models thought the market would be in terms of inventory and new listings. It's not quite there. It's below that. And so it's harder for the sales to accumulate when you just don't have people listing. It's hard to sell what you don't have, kind of thing, right? So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a dire picture on sales per se. I think it's actually doing better than some years that we've had. I think we're beating 2019 or something on a year-to-date basis right now, and maybe a few other years or something. So it's not the worst we've ever had, which is kind of surprising given the rate scenario, right? Like It's like that's probably one of the worst scenarios we've had in a really long time on the rate side of it. So that is, to me, it speaks a lot about Vancouver, not just Vancouver, it's British Columbia in general. We see this similar pattern unfolding in a lot of markets across BC, and it's just our region continues to grow. We don't have a huge amount of new product coming to market, and even when we do, it takes time for it to get there. We have really tight rental markets. It just all adds up to a picture of like more people coming, not enough for everybody, and there's really only one way things go when that's the story, right? There might be temporary deviations from a longer term trend, but the longer term trend is pretty hard to break in this case.
So one thing I'm just thinking about, I've had two conversations that stick out to me in relation to what we're talking about. One is a client of mine said when and his property was listed, he said when the Silicon Valley Bank collapsed, he said, good news. Like that's and it was clearly in relation to the Bank of Canada and what they were going to do and how that impacts interest rates. And I was thinking, it's so funny how our real estate market's almost like in bizarro world where like bad news for the global economy, even the Canadian economy potentially is good news if you're a seller in Vancouver real estate. And then the second one was I had a conversation with somebody yesterday who said, I'm really concerned, thinking about listing, I'm really concerned about a recession in the latter half of 2023. And again, it made me think about interest rates. But I guess, and potentially that not having the impact that he thinks. And I'm wondering, like, I guess, two questions. One is, if we did go into a recession, do you think that leads to more inventory? How do you think that actually plays out in this market? Or I guess recession or the idea of people having to renew at higher rates and suddenly there being a glut of inventory, like how does that play out?
Yeah, so great question. That speaks to one of the things that I find very interesting about our market. So first of all, in terms of the recession, the jury's still out on that. Like all the economic indicators right now aren't like flashing hot red signals saying, oh, this is definitely a recession. Right. However, there are some other things like inverted yield curve's been inverted for months now, like maybe even over a year. And like usually a recession happens within, 6 to 12 months of that happening. Hasn't quite happened yet. And like we don't, so we're still kind of waiting on economic data to confirm that. It's maybe the recession that never comes or something. It's the one everybody talks about but never comes. Maybe. I don't know. And then on that, like, does that cause a flood of inventory if we get a recession? Well, that ties into the jobs picture and the notion of that people's ability to own their home or pay for their home is directly tied to their jobs, which it is for like a lot of people. However, in British Columbia and actually across Canada, there's the data from census and stuff shows that like there's a lot of people who don't have mortgages on their properties. So there's like, I don't know, I think it's like 40% of Canadians or something are mortgage free or something like that. And that's a really high percentage of people. Now, they tend to be older. Many of them are retired and whatnot, so they're not even in the labor force. So there's really like no impact on that segment really from an economics perspective. If you're talking about a recession, it's like, well, if you're on a fixed income, you're older, you're retired, your house is paid off, you get, checks from the government. Well, there's not really much to talk about there, right? But when you move to that other side of the market where people are employed and so on, and they need to afford their homes and make the payments. And one of the interesting things about that I've been digging into, and I'll probably do a piece about it for the board or something at some point. So there's data that shows like the amount of mortgage outstanding by household in the region. And you get into this kind of interesting discussion around it where you can segment this data by first-time buyers or people who are not first-time buyers. And in the discussions around Vancouver real estate, people, or not just Vancouver, BC in general, or anywhere where the price is high, Toronto even, you get these comments that are like, oh, well, it's so expensive, and the minute that something breaks, everybody's going to be just shattered, and the economy,
Right.
because, there's no way that the average income can afford a $2 million house. Yeah, well, you look at the data and you look at how much mortgage debt is outstanding across all these houses. It doesn't add up to a story of like imminent doom and gloom. A lot of people have very reasonable, easily serviceable mortgages based on the incomes that they have. And think about it from just a perfectly rational and logical perspective. You take one of your clients to the bank to get a mortgage. They don't give you however much money you ask for, right?
Sure.
They say, oh, what's your income and what's your job? Is it steady? And what other assets do you have? And how much is your down payment and so on? And these factors.
And then they stress test it.
And then they stress test you, right? So the data in a lot of ways is not surprising at all about the distribution of mortgage debt across the economy and across households, because it's a function of lending standards, of underwriting. It's like the reason why it's not such a huge, risky, dangerous thing is because there was good underwriting behind a lot of these mortgages. Now, yes, if you have an economy that goes into the tank and there's job losses, some segment of the population is going to probably have to sell their homes. Historically, we've had a couple kind of big recessions in Canada, and it hasn't led to some absolute tsunami of supply or inventory, if you will, on the market that's caused dramatic price crashes. The last one, actually, I just did a video on this one. It's kind of cool, looking at every interest rate tightening cycle in history and then relating that to like what happened to prices and sales. And there's like a really interesting dynamic there where not every historical tightening cycle was associated with a decline in sales nor a decline in prices. There's some where prices actually increased in the face of these tightening cycles and so on. So now tightening cycles are different than recessions, though. So they're not the same. Sometimes they happen at the same time or very near each other, but they are not the same thing. So, but anyways, that's kind of what we're going through right now. We have this big increase in rates, and everybody's like, well, when's the next shoe going to drop? And it's like, I don't know if it will. We have a pretty strong underwritten market underneath of all of it. You've got a lot of intergenerational wealth transfers happening in our area. It's pretty sound under the hood, at least as far as I can tell, from the data that I look at. I have a hard time seeing those catastrophe scenarios materialized in any kind of short order, really. It's hard to imagine.
That's kind of the realization I think we've both come to after, doing this show for 7 years. That's kind of changed is there seems to be a strong foundation, at the base of it. But
I feel like people don't talk about the bubble as much as they did, right?
As they used to in 2015, 2016 per se. But the other thing just to kind of, because the inventory question, and you said you were talking about how the rental market's tight and about how there's nowhere really to move. And anecdotally speaking, we work with a lot of people that want to sell their house and move up in the market, but it's just so painful right now to do so that they'd almost rather do anything than try to make that move. And they stay put. And we've talked about like, will good news in the market, like the media getting behind, like the real estate market's back, will that trigger new inventory? And the other thing I'm thinking about is does inventory trigger more inventory? Like, because it becomes, like would like maybe more the rental market not being so tight and more options for people, so that it doesn't just seem like it's such a chore to actually leave your existing residence, right?
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's actually, you just twigged something in my brain for an analytical project that I'll do at some point. There's something really kind of interesting there, right? Like, I think there is maybe some kind of critically low level of inventory where it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling cycle of people saying, well, I'm not going to list because no one else is listing or whatever. But that's like, there's probably some levels where that starts to occur. I mean, I don't have data on people's psychological, state of mind when they're making these, but like, maybe there's a way to pull some kind of something interesting out of the data to show that, hey, when you hit these levels, new listings tend to stall or something like that for a while. And maybe there's some kind of correlation there. So yeah, it could be possible that you get like, I was hoping in the spring market that we actually would see a lot more people coming to market with their properties. It's one of the things that's been surprising me a little bit. I think the Bank of Canada's certainty that they've provided, or sort of certainty, as much as they normally provide certainty, it's like they're saying, well, we're mostly done with rate hikes for now, unless some kind of situation unfolds where inflation just takes off again and they need to just ramp up rates again to cool that. It doesn't seem to be evolving that way. It seems like they're going to hold rates where they are. And I think that's starting to bring a lot more confidence into the market, which I don't think was quite there in January and February. Now that we're into like March, April, I think that message is starting to sink into the market. And I do think the next few months are probably going to bring more buyers and sellers to the space.
Definitely stabilized, right? Like I feel like we used to have a question and we were asking everybody, like, is this the hardest moment to forecast that you've ever had?
It seems less difficult.
No, it's less difficult for sure. I would guess, unless there's some sort of black swan event.
That's really it. I think like those are always possible. Like I do always say anything can happen and stuff, because I think COVID's just such a great example. If you were talking to somebody, pre March 2020 and like you were interviewing somebody, what do you think is going to happen? It's like nobody would have said, hey, a global planned pandemic.
We literally have go back on the record. We have
go back to March 2020. There's a great episode about that.
So it's like, I think that it's such a great, it's horrible that it's happened, but it's a great reminder of just how fragile forecasts are and so on. They're really, it's your best guess at the time and given what you have. And right now it does feel a lot more stable with also the latest inflation prints are like quite encouraging. Mm-hmm. It's really starting to show that like, core inflation's still a little bit sticky, but whatever. It seems to be coming down, and it's coming down kind of along the path that the Bank of Canada had predicted, which is kind of unusual, honestly. Like
they'll stick the landing potentially.
Yes, it's like everybody was like, can they do a soft landing? I don't know. It's like, and if they do, it'll probably be one of the first ones in history or something. I struggle to think of one where they've pulled this off better so far, and I think it is working according to plan so far, and I'm hopeful that encourages people to get out there and make those moves and make the move up, because if you're a growing family or something, it's tough to be in a space with like small space and so on. So
I don't know if we were recording when we talked about this, but one of the things that you said earlier on, Andrew, was that there's a lot of voices that kind of share similar thoughts, but in some cases you kind of deviate from some of the stronger voices in our market. Can we talk a little bit about maybe some of the takes in our industry or other economists or even in the mainstream media that like where do you see yourself being a different voice, I guess?
Yes, great question. So just to preface this isn't any kind of slight against anybody that like, I'm not going to mention any names or anything, but there's certainly people and voices in the space that I don't fully subscribe to, and there's popular ones and so on. And it's just from my personal experience of the work that I've done over the years. I forgot to mention I worked at Altus Group back in the day as a consultant doing economic consulting and appraisal work. Totally forgot about that. Jeez. Anyways, like it was like a couple of years of my life, but somehow kind of just glossed over that chunk of it. But it was that experience was really super valuable, and I'm so like ever grateful for all the people at Altus that had me come in there and work with them. I learned a huge amount over a really short period of time. And what I learned a lot about that I didn't, I was an economist before that at CMHC. And so you take this very macro view of things, right? Like, oh, yeah, it's all macro economy things. It's all whatever, these big aggregate variables that are moving the economy around and influencing housing and so on. That's an interesting take. And it's one that a lot of people still subscribe to. And I don't harbor any kind of, resentment against somebody who continues to think that. However, in my experience working on the consulting side of it and, selling market studies and stuff to developers and whatever, who would come in and they would say, well, I'm proposing this project here. I want to do X number of units, and we want to know like what's the risk essentially, like what's coming down the pipeline, what's in the, what's the competitive product, how should we position this, how should we phase it, right? That's like the phasing thing is just like where I think it's a very clear example of how the aggregate thought of how economists and a lot of those strong voices in this milieu of things that we deal in, it's like glossed over. It's like, oh, well, if we just, all you have to do is move supply, right? You just have to shift that supply curve out. And it's like, well, doesn't quite work that way from like the development side of it. Because when like you look at it from if you're an individual developer, you go and look at it and you're like, well, yeah, it'd be nice if we could all in aggregate move the supply curve out. We all join hands and we, compete together to make this market more affordable. But like the reality is like, hey, they're businesses, you know, and like they can't all come out at the same time building huge amounts of supply, flooding the market and pushing down prices. And that's why, it's part of the reason why developers phase developments, right? You don't sell all of your product immediately, dumping it into the market because, it's not good for your performa, right? Like it's
supply shock.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. Well, it's not some kind of weird collusion thing or something like that. It's like I want to really make the point that it's because the production of housing from the private sector is a business, and it's not fair or correct to look at that side of the industry, point fingers, and say, well, they need to be doing more to make housing more affordable. It's like, well, do you go to work and like get less money when you come home? Because that's kind of what you're asking. That's literally what you're asking people to do in the development industry. And it kind of gets me a little bit, fired up because like I used to work at the government and like that is the position of a lot of people. That's like, well, we just need to make sure the bloody developers are doing more to it. And it's like, no, you don't get it. Like it's about making sure the numbers work. If you de-risk projects and you make things like a lot easier, yes, you'll get more supply. Will you get enough to flood the market and bring prices down? Probably not. That's a point where I think I differ from a lot of the kind of other voices in there that I'd be willing to put money on it that like we could upzone all of Vancouver tomorrow. I don't care. Like go to 100 floors. I don't care. Whatever. I'd be willing to put money down that you could, if you did that and you had shovels in the ground tomorrow, you wouldn't get enough supply to like push prices down, 40% or 50%, whatever the number is to get to that quote affordable level of housing. Because the numbers from a development side of it, they don't make sense after a while. You can't keep paying a high price for land and selling your end unit product at prices that don't justify the cost you paid for the land plus development costs. You can't do that sustainably. Now, in some kind of aggregate sense, like maybe you can get a lot of developers kind of competing with each other and so on to, bring things down over time. But you're talking about like 10, 20, 15 year timelines maybe to get like prices down 10, 15% under the most ideal of circumstances, where cities are getting out of the way and whatever. It's like, I really struggle to see, a very sound rationale of how that's exactly supposed to work. I know it's like a very popular movement right now. I mean, the political space and so on, like the latest provincial government plan is definitely looking at, upzoning single family neighborhoods and all that, which great. I'm not against doing more development, definitely do more development. There's tons of communities that are dying and they need more life injected to them and all that. I just think it's a bit disingenuous to sort of frame that policy and those kinds of policies as like the kind of thing that's going to be a magic bullet that brings affordability back to people who are, say earning $30,000 a year and like, well, I want to earn $30,000 a year, but I want that downtown condo, right?
I want to be in Kits.
It's exactly. I think there has to be a bit of an honesty around the discussion around it in terms of what expectations we might actually see or the outcomes we might actually see from big dramatic shifts in policy like that. And I think that's kind of where I differ with some of the voices because it's like some of the, and it may not be the case that I actually disagree with any of those folks. Like if I had discussions with them, it may just be that there's sometimes the way that people, they want to get their message out. So they use more sensational ways of spinning whatever it is they're saying to like make it more popular with people, right? So whether that's politicians or, individuals with some kind of particular angle or something. So
interesting. So if I understand that the logic there, though, is because we've had a number of people on over the years who have talked about, Minneapolis' rezoning a couple years ago that was very popular amongst a certain subset of the folks that are looking at the housing shortage in various areas of North America. But the logic is no matter what, it's kind of a business where it just takes a huge amount of time to build new product, but B, with a pro forma, the numbers have to make sense. And if they don't make sense, as we've seen in the last year or two, everybody hits pause and there's a trickle out. And it's so that as a silver bullet, like we have too many single family homes in Vancouver, right? You hear that all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe we do, but the idea that upzoning those single family homes is going to make any meaningful change in the next decade or two, you're saying is wishful thinking.
Yeah, I would say it's a bit, it's wishful in the sense that there's a lot more happening than just the zoning question. So, what we observe today right now in terms of housing prices and everything that we have around us is not just a function of zoning. Zoning makes some portion of it, and perhaps a very meaningful portion of it in some specific areas, much more than others too, right? It might be the case that in some area, zoning is the only thing holding back supply, but it could be in other areas that it has nothing to do with what's holding back supply. Like I can think of sites, I'm not going to name them, but I can think of sites that exist that are large, they're zoned already, and there's a housing crisis in quotes, and they're not being developed, and they could unleash like thousands of units into the market instantaneously if they could build it faster. But it's built, it's got the applications, it's gone through the city.
They could build it if they want to.
They could build it if they want to, and they don't. And it's not, again, I'm not trying to point fingers at the development industry or something like that. It's a business, right? And you as develop, and I think this is another point where I differ in my thinking about development and all of that than a lot of other traditional economists. Like economists will talk about housing like they're widgets. Developers don't talk about housing like they're widgets. They're projects. They're things that have meaningful legacies and lasting impressions on people. These are houses for people. Every one of them is different. Somebody's going to have their kid in there. They're going to, find out their parent died in one of those, whatever, right? Like life happens in these spaces. Developers, by and large, don't think of houses as widgets per se. And like that is fundamentally one of the big issues of why the little kind of supply and demand framework of Econ 101, a lot of people like to paint it as, it's why that model doesn't really apply precisely to the housing market as we know it. Houses are not widgets. They're not all the same thing. If they were, well, maybe that logic of the little supply and demand model actually holds a bit more weight. But because they're not, it actually operates under a different model that you don't learn in Econ 101 usually. It's imperfect competition and probably the most accurate kind of model for that from the economics language of things. It would be like monopolistic competition. And that's not to say that it's a full-on monopoly thing. There's still competition. It's just that under a perfect competition regime with the classical Econ 101 thing, what happens is in that model, the assumption is that developers could produce as much as they want, almost infinitely, and it'll all sell into the market instantaneously, and it'll be absorbed like right away. And it's just like limitless. There's infinite demand, essentially. That's what the canonical little model of that's one of the big assumptions of it. But in reality, it doesn't work that way. Developers make decisions about how much to produce contingent on how much other developers are producing in the market. And so there's a constraint there built into the limit, if you will, on how much the development community will build. And it's not even developers. It's actually, I would take it a one rung back is that it's lenders. Lenders are risk averse.
Right.
And they're not good. Like developers would be happy to roll the dice with a project if they could get the free money, but the lenders, no, that's what those reports I used to do at Altus and stuff with. They were usually to satisfy a lender who wanted to know that, hey, the project's like sound, it's got proper demand for it, it'll sell well, or it'll be rented up, leased up quickly. And, there's all those kinds of questions that need to be answered. And I think the simple little supply demand thing, it starts to get into a world where, all houses are widgets and all we have to do is flood the market with widgets and then everybody's happy because prices fell. And it's like, it's just, sorry, that's just not reality. It's not a model that I think is well suited to describing reality as we see it. And I think that is one of the big hindrances in discussions at the policy level of things where, organizations like CMHC and stuff that I used to work at, like that's how things are thought of to some degree, is that houses are these aggregate things and it's just units that people live in. We just got to match people to units. But people don't live in units. They live in homes, like it's your house. Like it's like it's like your space, It's like there's like lots of really deeply personal things about it. People aren't indifferent about that unit or that unit. They're extremely particular about that unit or that unit. You know, like you go take a client to like a new condo tower or something, and you could have the exact same floor plan, exact same finishes, everything. And you go up one floor and they're like, yeah, I like this one more. And it's like, why? I mean, it's like basically looking at the exact same thing. From an economist perspective of it, they would say, well, it's just a unit. They're the same unit.
Yeah.
No, not to a client. Definitely not. There's something very personal about the space. It's just the way that the light hits or whatever it might be, something that you can't quite convey. And those things matter, I think, in a very big way in the discussion around real estate and how you make it more affordable. Supply is absolutely part of the answer to that. I don't think there's any serious answer that doesn't involve dramatically increasing the amount of homes that we have available. But I think it also has to be a realistic discussion about, how much supply is possible to produce from the private sector, not just from the feasibility side of it, but also, the practical elements, jobs. Do you got enough labor to do it? What about materials and things, right? Like the costs of things. If everybody starts building really quickly together, that drives costs up because everybody's competing for the same labor pool, same materials. There's all these things that start happening that make it very challenging for the little, simple supply and demand model to unfold as theory predicts. And so that's, I think, my very long-winded way of kind of differentiating myself from some of the other voices there. It's like, look, I'm not trying to be crass about it or harsh or like, very disappointing to people who might be hoping that there's, some kind of policy over the horizon that's going to make life or buying a home or something achievable for them. I'm just trying to be realistic about it, where it's like, if you're somebody sitting there hoping that next year the government's got a policy that's going to make, you able to afford a home that you want, I think it might be sensible to start considering other options, and realistic ones, right? Because it's not going to make your life better to sit around and complain about, oh, that's so unaffordable and whatever. Not that everybody's a complainer, just like it's not good for your soul to sit around feeling awful about your housing situation. And if you have options available to you, I think it's really important to try to exercise those, because I don't think there's like a knight in shining armor over the horizon that's just going to come swoop in, make housing super affordable next year. And even if you have great policies that do things, it takes a long time to bring, new product to market. It really does. And it's so, I know it's such a depressing kind of sour sounding thing, but it's like, I'm not.
Yeah.
One thing we haven't ever talked about is just how important the underwriting is. I mean, it's unbelievable. To put it in that context. And yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing that really comes to mind is, outside of policy, like, do you see the government having a role in supply creation, and is that a feasible? It sounds like it's not a feasible expectation, but I mean, one famous comment on our show was at the time John Horgan was John Horgan couldn't build a doghouse, but and I'm not sure if David Eby could either. But the point is the development community does it well.
They know what they're doing.
They know what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the key. You really got to. I think if you want to get more market supply, you definitely have to make policies that move the needle in that direction. And that takes understanding what are the levers that the private development market finds most, painful. And zoning is certainly one of them, but there's a lot of other.
I think GST on rental.
I was just going to say, And like today, there's like, CMHC's announcing like increases to their lending program.
Right,
their
I
rates.
saw that.
And like that's insult to injury on a situation where like rental, you do a rental pro forma, you look at it like, I don't know why people build rental. Honestly, it scares the, whatever out of me. Like I look at those numbers, I'm like, man, the margins are thin on that. That's a sketchy game. And maybe I'm just really bad at modeling it from a pro forma side of it, but it concerns me when I look at that and you're like, well, how's it going to work with higher rates plus now like higher lending costs from there? It's like, it's just not going to, that's not going to translate to, more product. And that really worries me. And like from the government side of it, like I think that's kind of, the terminus of my logic really is that I don't see a realistic scenario for the private market to deliver sufficient supply to say if sufficient is defined as, bringing home prices down 50% or something like from a supply effect, right? I don't think that's a realistic possibility in any short period of time. That might be possible over 50 years or something like that, but that's not the time scale that most people voting governments in on housing policy issues want. If you're, somebody right now who feels shut out of the housing market and you're voting for a politician who's claiming they're going to do something about it, I mean, you're asking for a home tomorrow, not 25 years from now. And so, like I said, the kind of end point of my kind of logic on that is really, well, you get to the point where you have to say government is really the only entity that will build at a loss. And what that loss is, it's called a subsidy. When government builds at a loss, that is directly taking taxpayer money and putting it back into the community in some other form. It's redistributive. That's what the role of government is. Now, then you get to the political discussion of it. Do we collectively, as a society of voters, collectively agree to vote in a government who's proposing spending enormous amounts of money on developing, below market housing or whatever it might be? Do we collectively agree to that? Because what that's going to mean for many of us is significantly higher taxation rates on all kinds of things, whether it be your property or your income tax or whatever. You got to fund it somehow, and the money's not going to come from sky, it's got to come from somewhere. And so that's where you get into that political issue where, I think a lot of voters, as much as they want to see affordability improve and everything, when it comes to your own pocketbook, it's sort of like, well, I'll do it up to the point where it doesn't hurt me too bad.
Exactly.
So,
and should people in Victoria be concerned about Vancouver or whatever? I think the other thing, it's interesting, but your take on the pro forma on the market rentals. It's interesting that right now it seems like where a lot of people in the media are demonizing like REITs has been that's actually the one.
No, but
one
David
model.
Eby is
David
demonizing
Eby
REITs
specifically, but it's unbelievable because you think about it, we had Wendy Waters on recently, and her take on it was the only reason REITs will do this is because of the 10 to 20 year forecast. Because they're looking at the same numbers you're looking, and they're scratching their head, going "This doesn't make sense."
Better be a
today.
growth area here.
They're betting in the region, right? So it's it seems like you could be leveraging or incentivizing. Meanwhile, it's the latest boogeyman or whatever, right?
That's a really it's a brutal one because. Like you said, I'm sure Wendy's knows exactly what she's talking about. She definitely deals in that space and probably knows more than I do about it. But I think it's incredibly important that you actually invite that kind of money to the rental side of it. And I know somebody probably listening to this is the guy from the real estate board saying, you got to bring in, corporate money.
Yeah, exactly.
And trust me, I worked for the government and I worked for the so-called good guys at some point, you know what I mean? Trying to make things affordable. And I can tell you that it's perceived over there that, it depends on who you talk to, but there's certainly been messaging from fairly prominent voices in the advocacy space for housing in our region who have demonized REITs and so on. And it comes at a tremendous cost, in my view, because those institutions are the few that exist that are willing to take low yield, stable cash flows. And they're a private investor would not be going into a bond's at 4 or 5% right now. Why would you go into a rental project yielding 3% on a going in rate or something, even if you can jack rents over time? You can't do it right away. There's tenancy laws and all kinds of things. You can't just walk in, kick everybody out and whatever, under a demoviction scenario. But those are, as much as that's claimed to be a thing, it's not really a thing. There isn't that many REITs going around vacating entire buildings to renovate, because there's a huge cost to renovate an old building like that. You don't want to kick out the income in place on it. You just bought it with income in place. You don't want to get rid of your income stream that you literally just paid money for. It's if you wanted a vacant building, just go buy one, I don't know. So anyways, it's crazy to me that that's even considered a sound thought around the thing. It's just man, REITs are super important to that space, and they're going to become even more important as we have an aging population that's going to need that retirement income that they're pending. They really need, we have a huge aging population, and that whole segment of the population is going to need money coming to them. And that money's got to come from somewhere. And those rental projects, those are great streams of income for REITs and pension funds and things like that because they're stable. And there's like those funds as well, they're guided by various regulations and things of what they can invest into and how much they can invest and what they can do. So it's not as like Wild Westy as it sounds too. You know, when you just say, oh, REITs and pension funds, it's like they're not like BlackRock or something. Like, you know, like they're way more tame from a, you know, investment side of things. I mean, you look at like all of the underwriting and due diligence and everything they have to do before they even enter into the various investments. It's like you start seeing this other side of it where like they're like, no, we're genuinely investing in these projects for long-term stable cash flows. Yes, we will probably increase rents over time by the maximum allowable increase. And yes, we will probably reinvest in these buildings and hold them for longer periods of time. And then hopefully, you know, they'll redevelop them and build more units out of them, which would be ideal. Of course, it sucks for the tenants in place, but look, the region's growing and you gotta open up the housing supply somehow, and it can't all be greenfield. And I mean, there definitely needs to be good policies in place to deal with that issue of, you know, tenants in place and whatever. But, you know, a lot of the older rental stock in Vancouver is occupying primo development land for more rental.
Sure.
So it's like something's got to give, you know, and like there's a, you know, a rental, I can't remember what they're calling it, but like a $500 million fund for buying up old rental or something like that. And I mean, in one sense, it's a good idea because, like, you know, you're protecting what they're calling affordable rental, right? But the reason it's affordable is like because the buildings are kind of old and not great, and also that the tenants in place have had rent control in place. And if the unit were to turn over, it wouldn't be, quote, affordable instantaneously. But regardless, the point is, like, I don't know how helpful that policy is in a kind of aggregate sense, where it's like, on the one hand, it helps people immediately who are in those places, but it also holds back the potential redevelopment of sites that definitely should be redeveloped as higher density rental or whatever. So, you know, that's one of those kind of clear areas where policy sometimes shoots itself in the foot, I think. Like, it's like you have a goal, right, that they're defining of housing affordability, but then they create policies that don't quite, you know, nail that direction because they have things moving in the opposite direction that not all aligned, you know? So it's, it's challenging.
I feel like it is challenging.
Yeah, no kidding. No kidding.
You know, maybe, and we've kept you for a while here, Andrew. I'm just wondering. I know, you know, you had a forecast out in January. Sounds like you kind of put your thumb on the scale a bit because you're like, man, these models are showing numbers. Everybody's going to think I'm nuts.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
And we've already surpassed at least the numbers released. Based on where we're at today, like, how do you see the rest of the year playing out in terms of pricing, and maybe even 1, 3, and 5?
And just also, I just want to put into context for the listener that's maybe maybe not tuned into the market right now, but there's lots of multiple offers going on right now. We're seeing prices in a lot of cases like higher than previous sales from
rebounding very quickly in terms of where the pricing is.
Just to give some people some context, the market seems dramatically busier just in the last little bit here, a few weeks, a month or so.
Yeah. So great question again. The way the forecast was set up, it's kind of an annual forecast. So, but a lot of forecasts, they do like an annual average price where it's the price across the entire year. I was doing it a little bit differently where we're going to say, you know, like this was the price at the end of the year. And then we're going to say what the price will be at the end of the year, not the average for the whole year.
Right.
So that's a subtle difference between my forecast and some of the other ones you'll see from like big banks and stuff, which will be, a lot of those are still calling for like negative price. And that's part of the reason why mine's a little bit different is just the time frames and stuff that I've chosen to focus on in that. I think like, you know, with the multiple offers and so on, I mean, it's sort of showing up in the data now that we're like, you don't see the multiple offers per se, but you do see like over asked sales and you know, some people I think often say, oh, well, that's just realtors just juicing the asking price. You know, they're underpricing just to get that over asked thing. It's like, I don't know about that, you know, because when you look at the actual, what it should cost from a sort of appraisal perspective for one of those homes, it's like, no, a lot of these prices are pretty reasonable, like where they're set by the agents and so on. So
I also feel like it's one thing that a lot of people don't understand about that strategy is if you're not feeling very confident about the product and the market, you don't put something on for 99 cents when it's worth $1.80, right? Like it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it can backfire on you for sure. It's not always a good strategy, but regardless, we're definitely seeing, a pretty significant uptick on the pricing. But that's that inventory problem again, right? So like when I go back to that forecast and I think about where sales are supposed to be, it was supposed to be 29,000 something end of the year for Greater Vancouver Real Estate Board areas, and that's in line with historical norms. But are we going to get there? I don't know, because the inventory and the new listings isn't quite getting there to get those sales numbers. But that's what's driving that price higher, and that's why you're getting those multiples. Is like there's not a lot to choose from out there, and when somebody sees something great, a great home that they like, they could see themselves in, right? It's not just a unit. It's like it's their new home, and you can get excited about it. And like, I don't think there's anything wrong with multiples necessarily. It's just a function of the way the market works, and it's the way that we distribute scarce resources in an economy like this. Like that's how else would you do it, Right. So I think that's probably going to result in a higher price at the end of the year, that further higher than what our forecast was calling for, which again, I did put my thumb on the scale, bringing it down. It called for about 1% to 2% growth across almost all product types. But like, I think we could be higher than that, and like 4 or 5%, maybe even higher. I don't know. It really depends how it shakes out. And the latter half of the year, I do think that we'll probably see a pickup somewhat. Like there's seasonal patterns to the market, right? So like the back end of the year, from the summer to the winter, usually things start to slow down, but I think that'll be slightly busier than normal. That's kind of my guess, is because that settling of the interest rates and all that, where like a lot of buyers or sellers out there are starting to adjust to the fact that like, okay, 5-year fixed is whatever it's at. It's been at that for a little while. It hasn't been moving around very much. It might be comfortable refinancing or getting a new mortgage or moving, whatever, in those kinds of scenarios. So I could see it being a little bit busier on the back half, and we'll see though. Bring me around at the end of the year, and we'll see. You can shame me for my terrible forecast.
We've taken a lot of your time today, Andrew, but it's been a very fascinating conversation. So I appreciate you coming on. We do have this segment called the 5 Wire, 5 lighthearted questions that we end every show with. Can you stick around for that?
Sure, of course.
Okay, all right. So number 1 is one book you've read recently that you would recommend for our listeners.
So I don't really read a lot of books, like fiction sort of thing. I read like technical manuals and like stuff like that, which
there's an HVAC manual or something. Yeah.
Like honestly, literally the last book that I remember reading was the Canadian Electrical Code, and I was like reading it for various reasons. And so, but actually what I've been reading, I read a lot of like interesting papers and things like that. Not always academic, but usually like research papers of sorts. One that's come out recently is Microsoft. They just put out, like their research team put out this paper a little while ago on AI, and it's called like Sparks of Artificial General Intelligence or something. And it's this pretty lengthy technical paper that I wouldn't recommend for people for like a light-hearted read necessarily, but it for people interested in it, it's fascinating because they get into talk. They're kind of kicking the tires on GPT-4, which is sort of this like...
We just paid for a subscription for it.
Yeah, so there's Chat GPT, but GPT itself is sort of like the technology, and Chat GPT is like a way of interacting with it, essentially. You chat with the
GPT.
So we've got the Chat
I can't believe you didn't know that.
GPT-4.
Yeah.
So that's what we're not talking about the same thing.
Well, it is similar, but it's just like there's the tech that kind of drives it, and it's it's a fascinating. I haven't finished reading, but it's they kind of go through like kicking the tires, seeing how it works in various scenarios. Like, can it do math? Can it like interact with a human well? Can it paint a picture? Can it and they're really kind of trying to elucidate where the boundaries of this technology are in this thing. So fascinating read, because it's these are the developers of these kinds of products and so on, and so they're kind of giving you an inside view of what people are thinking about how that technology might evolve down the line and so on. So fascinating. I mean, the AI thing is just I'm infatuated with it now. Like it's just it's opened Pandora's box of things, and there's no going back. For somebody like me, that's kind of I tinker with things all the time. I like building stuff, and like GPT and Chat GPT is like a really incredible tool for coding work, which I do a lot of. It's just fascinating. Like I can code I can take something written in one language, coding language, shove it into Chat GPT and be like, here, give that to me in a different language. And then I can build like on that. And it's like that, you would have to pay a developer quite a bit of money to do that just, even 5 weeks ago or something. And it's like, now you can just do, it's absolutely mind blowing. So I think I think we're honestly on the cusp of like this. It's kind of like when the internet came around, right? And like people are like, who cares about pets.com or something? It's like, well, you're about to start caring about like all of these things. Like this is in my view, probably the next like big thing,
fundamental shift,
as big as the internet or bigger. Yeah, I think it's just going to change the way we do everything. The technology, it will be integrated into everything that you do. Everything you touch from now on is going to start having some AI element into it.
I just was listening. I can't remember who was saying this, but they were saying that if you're not learning GPT right now, and you're not understanding it or implementing it or learning how to communicate effectively with it, like that's what everybody should be doing. You're going to be left behind in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's a lot of worry about it taking jobs and all these kinds of things, which is possible. Like anything's always possible. But the older I've gotten, the more I've tried to look at the world in a more positive, kind of optimistic sense, even though the subject of our conversation was not very, like optimistic and so on. But it's because of the context we're operating in. But in this case, it's like, I think there's a lot of reasons to be very hopeful that technologies like that are really going to create a lot of positive impacts and change in the world. And I think the kinds of jobs and things that will come out of these technologies, the new availability of work, the kinds of things that people can do, it's just going to revolutionize like a lot of what we do as a society and so on. And just, I see a lot of potential for great things. There's, of course, with that risk and potential that it could kill us all, I guess. There is that looming possibility, but let's try to brush that under the rug and use it for some fun things in the meantime.
Write me a resume. Anyway, that's the first time we've talked about GPT on the show, so there's a first.
Okay, in the last few years, Andrew, what new belief, behavior, or habit has most improved your life?
Well, we got a dog a couple of years ago, so it's kind of like a habit, I guess, if you will, like taking her for walks. So you get a dog. She's a bigger dog, like 60 pounds, 70 pounds or something. So you can't just like leave her on the couch all day. She'll turn into a giant couch potato. Right. So you got to get out there for walks. So we do, pretty big walks every single day, and it's just good for you as an individual, your health and stuff. But it's good to get out there and clear the mind and kind of just spend some time with your significant others or whatever. And it's that's been a hugely positive change.
Forces you out even when you don't want to go out.
Yeah, even when it's raining, right?
Yeah. Question number 3, what have you been binge watching lately, or a movie recommendation?
Yeah, again, like I'm such a geek that I don't really watch like TV and things. I would be on Chat GPT or something instead of watching TV. But like we
describe a movie to me.
Yeah, pretty much.
Rewrite Rocky.
Like I guess when the pandemic hit, everybody kind of hunkered down, and I know we kind of like binged watched, like I think it's called Narcos or something. Yeah. So that did not help with the anxiety levels of things. that initial, pandemic was stressful enough initially, and I mean, watching a show like that with so much violence and kind of crazy stuff happening, didn't help. But it was a pretty good show, entertaining for sure.
Apparently, that was one of the big reasons that tourism in Colombia has grown so much. They said that it was a result of the Netflix. I think that's the Netflix show, right?
Yeah,
Narcos,
I think so.
They're still on Netflix. Yeah. But yeah, that's increased tourism. So,
wow.
Favorite band or music, and this. We'll have to harken back to your former career here.
Yeah, so it's kind of a funny thing because as somebody who kind of creates music and things, I'm not like a person with a favorite band. Kind of like I'm sort of like I listen to lots of things. Like I love just about every kind of music, and grew up in the '80s, so I've had that shift through various music phases, of life, like the 80s, like you had metal and grunge and stuff comes out in the 90s. And then there's the hip hop phase that started happening in the 2000s. And then, so gone through all of that. But the older I've gotten, really like coming back to like jazz, classical, flamenco is one that I like. I play like flamenco style guitar and whatever. So that's this type of music that I listen to because it's complex. It's very like rich in terms of its structure and whatever. So it's gives me a lot now. The older that I am, like a pop song is great, but like these more complex pieces really do things for my, my mental interest of this stuff. So yeah, that's kind of what I listen to these days.
That's great. And last but not least, something that you've purchased for under $1,500 that's had a positive impact on your life.
Yeah, I'm not a big spender. I'm so like cheap. I don't $1,500. Like I don't even spend anywhere close to that kind of money. Like, actually something I bought on the music thing. I hadn't been doing much music composition or writing or anything like that for a long time, and I just decided one day I was like, well, I should probably dust off all the old music gear. So I start doing that. And I'm like, oh, a lot of this stuff doesn't work. It doesn't even like plug. It's like USB 1.0 and it like won't plug into things and like it's not working. The software is all buggy. It doesn't. I was like, I should just buy some new stuff. So I did. I went and bought like the software package from Native Instruments that gives you like a bunch of cool sounds and keyboards and whatever. And then bought some like recording gear, if you will, for just patching into the computer or whatever. Like it's like a kind of like a mixing deck, but it's got more functionality to it, whatever. Anyways, when I bought one of those things, and I was like, just being a kind of cheap person, I was like, I really don't want to spend the money, but I'm really glad I did. It's fun. I've been making little musical selections and stuff since, and it's been a fun kind of experience to get back into it. Pretty rusty, but it's fun.
And you're not selling them?
This time I think I'll just keep them for myself.
Matt's asking because he's burgeoning hip hop career here. Yeah. But well, maybe we'll leave it there. But Andrew, that was a fantastic conversation. How can people find out more about what you're up to, and of course, we got to plug the lead blog, or vlog. I'm not sure the videos, which we are big fans of. You're doing a really great job over there. But also, what's happening at the board?
Yeah, thanks. So definitely, you can get in touch with me if you want to send an email at alis@rebgv.org. And I'm thankful to my group there at Communications at REBGV. We've just got a new kind of economic section on the website. It's a bit rough around the edges in some ways. We got to polish some things up, but there's content up there. So that's a great way to find out about what I'm up to, the things I'm producing. You just go to the rebgv.org and then hit on Market Watch, and then there'll be a little thing for economics there. You can find all the videos like the lead, and the lead has a blog that accompanies it here and there. And our forecast, and you can find the presentation I did there. So everything should be there. And if you don't find it, just send me an email and I can send you the right link to something. It should be there. So yeah, that's probably the best ways to get in touch with me. And
well, super happy to see that all the content that's happening there. And that's fantastic. Well, thanks again for taking the time today.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on the show.